Hello, America. I'm Brilyn Hollyhand, Editor-in-Chief of the Truth Gazette, and I'm honored to be here today with General John Caldwell of the U.S. military, retired. We are so honored to have him today in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Thank you so much for your service, sir.
You're very welcome, brother.
And thank you very much for sitting down with us today. It's an honor to be here with you.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. I've always admired your grandfather, and when this was an opportunity, I wanted to take it.
Well, thank you. Our first question for today, can you please start off by sharing some of your background in the military to our viewers?
Sure, Brian, I'd be pleased to. I never viewed that I came from a military family, although it turned out that my father and my uncles of that year group and vintage all served in World War II. And then several of my cousins, first cousins, went to other military schools, but I just never considered myself being from a military family. But I got very interested in going to West Point, so that was how my military career started. And I graduated in 1967, which we may talk about a little bit later. And I was commissioned in the Armor and the Cavalry in 1967. At that time, the country was in turmoil. You had the combination of the Vietnam War, a lot of the race riots, the economy was peaking out, etc. When I retired, I was fortunate enough to serve over 36 years after West Point. West Point was 4 years. And I was fortunate enough to be promoted many times to the rank of Lieutenant General. And at the time I retired, I was the senior uniformed acquisition officer that had direct oversight of our technology generation and our weapon systems acquisition, with some minor exceptions, maybe mainly in the strategic missiles and that. Before that, I was commanding general of the U.S. Army Tank Automotive and Armaments Command up in Detroit, which at that time, Anniston Army Depot was one of my subordinate commands. We had about 11,000 people at that time in the command. Before that, I was responsible for helping transition the Army from the analog command and control and situational awareness to the digital technologies. And probably where I had the most success in many ways, it's hard to gauge it that way, but I was in charge of the Army's tank programs for 4 years, and specifically the digital versions of the Abrams tank, and those went into battle. Well, the digital versions didn't go into battle until later, but the Abrams tank went into battle very successfully in Desert Shield, Desert Storm. My wartime experience was in Vietnam in the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment.
Okay, well, what accomplishments in your career are you most proud of that helped our country?
Well, you know, I thought about that answer a lot. And in 36 years, I got an opportunity to do a lot of things, to work with great people. So I really did give a lot of thought to this. And I came out with the list. The number one is I had the opportunity to develop future leaders of the Army. Actually, both military and civilian, because where I ended up in the acquisition world is that the preponderance of the people you lead and manage are civilians, and so I took great pride in that. When I was the 3-star, I was the director of the Army Acquisition Professionals, which had about 50,000 people, and most of them were civilians. I guess I would say that leading soldiers in combat was a unique experience that you have to list. As I mentioned, I was head of the Army's tank programs for 4 years, and the Abrams tank is still the main ground weapon system of the Army, even though it's been modified and improved over time. And then one, which until I really thought about this, my first combat duty was in the streets of Washington, D.C. in April of 1964, after Martin Luther King was killed, and the country was coming apart. I was stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland, in the 6th Armored Cav Regiment, and we deployed with munitions with tear gas, etc., and we had to essentially rescue the city.
In 1967, like you said earlier, you graduated from the famed military academy, West Point. How do you believe West Point prepared you for your jobs while serving and beyond?
Well, the answer to that can be a long story. First of all, West Point was founded in 1802, and it is the first engineering school in the United States. And it's the fabric of West Point is inextricably tied to the birth and growth of the United States. So that's pretty big. But West Point is really, at that level, it is not only an engineering school, and it's modified over time, but what hasn't changed, it is a leadership development school. And it's a commissioning source. Actually, a fairly small percentage of the officers in the Army are commissioned at West Point. It's somewhere around 8-9%. So I would say that the leadership development and the fact that you're competing with the very best in the country. And so I was a pretty good student here at Tuscaloosa High School. I wasn't the smartest one by a long way, but I was okay. I was a good athlete, but I wasn't a great athlete. But I knew that by going to West Point, I had the opportunity to go to school with, compete with, learn with, team with the very best talent of my age group in the country, and that was big. You learn about teamwork. Very few people succeed on their own, and so everything is about a team. Being in the Army is about being on a team. You're very fortunate here in the state of Alabama. If you listen to a lot of things Coach Saban says, it's about teamwork above individual work.
Our country's had some amazing changes under President Trump. How do you believe our military has changed since President Trump has taken office?
Well, things run in cycles, Brilyn. And so, I mean, to answer your question directly, the military is always changing if it's doing its job, but it has to do at least two things. Overall, it has to win all of its wars. It's best if you don't get in a war, and so you avoid getting in a war if you can through deterrence by being stronger and more capable than potential adversaries. But the two things are you have to win whatever war you're in, and we've been in a war and are continuing in a war for now, depending on how you count it, more than 15 years. And then you have to plan and invest in the future. And those investments are in leader development, in advanced technology, in doctrine on how to fight, etc., across the whole spectrum. We're an international force. And so President Trump I have never met President Trump, but he articulates that he understands that. And he has placed confidence in the military leaders that he's appointed and the associated civilian leaders to lead the Army to the future. Now, what has emerged is that we've moved back to what we're calling peer and near-peer threats. The capabilities of Russia, the capabilities of China. And so while we're still trying to win the wars we're in today, we know that in most respects the enemy we're fighting there does not have the capabilities that a peer or a near peer will have and in many cases have now. So it's a big challenge, but we're trying to face up to that challenge.
China and North Korea are both great threats to our country. How do you believe our military compares to those of that of other countries?
Well, China specifically, we are small. We are a smaller military than a lot of the militaries. Iraq, the Iraqi army was, I don't know if the ratio is exactly right, but something like 4 times larger than the U.S. Army. We have, in our Army now, has about 470,000 active duty soldiers. Plus the Guard is another 300, plus the Reserves is another 200,000. So our Army, total Army, is about 1 million, but once again, only 470,000 are active. That is very small, given that we have a worldwide strategy and commitments. So how do you offset that? We have been a people-oriented Army. We know we have to develop superior leaders, and those superior leaders will develop superior soldiers. And that, in my mind, is the distinguishing factor. When we have foreign military officials come, we expose them to our young soldiers and our young non-commissioned officers and our young officers, and they all are amazed. How do you do that? So obviously we make technology investments. We develop wonderful weapon systems and all that, but without the right soldiers and leaders and the training associated with that, we would not be a distinguishing military in my mind.
Some say that military and politics are completely separate. Others say that they are in sync. What are your thoughts on the political involvement in our nation's military?
Well, it'd be interesting to know who says they're in sync, but the schooling says, the military is apolitical, and there's one way of looking at it that it is. But if you really look at the big picture, in my view, the resourcing of the military is about the battle for the allocation of the nation's resources. Those resources are the monetary, the tax revenues and all that, as well as the human resources. That is essentially a political debate and struggle. And so, in my view, certainly the senior military would fail at their job if they are not politically astute. Now, that doesn't mean they are politically oriented to one party or another. Now, when there is a president and administration, the president is the commander-in-chief, and they report through the Secretary of Defense to the president. So you have a loyalty to the Constitution, and hopefully that matches with the tendencies of the president, etc. But at the highest levels, the heads of the services and the joint organizations have to fight for the resources they believe they need to be successful in deterring war, and if you can't deter war, to win the wars that you are in.